Hello, and welcome to the first episode of a new podcast called The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian. Our goal is to use a 30-minute format to answer questions that have occurred to me as a curious Christian, and we also hope to include questions from listeners. We're a little new at this, so we'll learn as we go along. I predict improvements in sound quality and things like that as we learn more and more how to do this. But please be patient with us. I think we'll be able to offer some interesting content, and we will improve the format as we go along. This is David J. Lucy, the Reverend David J. Lucy. He's the rector of St. Francis of Great Falls, Virginia. And this man has more degrees than a thermometer. He has a degree in economics from Hampton-Sydney in Virginia. He has an MBA from the Babcock School at Wake Forest and a Master's of Divinity from the General Theological Seminary in New York. His sending parish was the beautiful St. Bartholomew in New York, and he has more than 20 years of experience in the ministry. David is married to Catherine Lucy and has 5 children who are ensconced in various places in the eastern half of the United States, all doing very interesting things. I'm Kathy Woolman, and I'm a curious Christian. I'm a lawyer by training and a Roman Catholic by background, raised in a strict and observant Roman Catholic family, but there was always room for curiosity. Why do we do that? And so that's the idea behind the podcast, that we get to ask David, what is this about and why do we do that? So today's topic is, why do priests dress like that? The first thing you might notice when you walk into a church service is that the people in the congregation and the priest on the altar in many denominations are wearing vastly different garb. So let's start with that, David. Why do priests dress like that?
Because we're slow to change. So the priestly garments that we wear and you see currently are some variation of garments that were worn in the ancient Roman Empire. This is especially true among Roman Catholic clergy, Anglican clergy, Lutheran clergy, and Orthodox clergy. History, we move slowly in the church. That's why it took, 400 years for Copernicus to be let off of the hook from the Roman Catholic Church. So yeah, it's like that. We like to investigate deeply, and because of our slowness to change, people have gotten used to those garments as signaling certain things. So, especially among priests and deacons and bishops, the garments they wear mean something and mean something very important to people who worship in those traditions. So that's why we wear what we wear. There are particular garments for particular purposes, and you may want to ask questions about that, but that's why. It's
Yes,
pretty simple.
I am curious. I know you do 2 services, 2 Sunday services, one at 8 a.m. and the other at 10 a.m. And when you wake up in the morning and you're getting ready to go to that first service, do you put on a suit? Show us how you build the vestments.
Traditionally, because of our tradition-bound office, we wear conservative clothing that have been worn by clergy for a while now. So if I get up to go to work, as Kathy told you, I had an MBA and I used to put on a suit when I was a banker. And when I put on my suit and necktie as a banker, I assumed the office of banker. And now when I get up, I still put on a suit on Sunday mornings because I'm old fashioned, even though not all my parishioners actually wear suits anymore. I put on a shirt that has a collar, a detachable collar to it. And that detachable collar came about in sort of in the middle of the 19th century. So back in the day, clergy started wearing shirts, not a thing called a cassock. We'll talk about that in a minute. And when they would put on their shirt, they would then wear a vest over it, and they wore a white necktie. a cravat underneath that. And so back in those days, the collar of the vest generally stood up a little bit and covered part of the white cravat. But that's the distinctive dress. So the clergy, in order to make certain that they made sure that people would tell they were still clergy, would wear black wear, very dark, or black, and they would wear that vest and they'd wear that white collar, and people would know them. Other people wore other kinds of cravats, like the necktie, the corporate necktie today. You show your fashion sense by wearing more fashionable neckties and that sort of thing. The same thing was true back then. The clergy wanted to present a formal but conservative image to the people. So that's part of where that comes from. So I would get dressed in a suit and go with my what is now a plastic collar. You can still get linen and cotton ones, but trying to find somebody who will starch those collars up so that you can wear them and not worrying about them drooping, it's really hard to find. There are some, by the way, if you wanted to, there are some DIY videos that show you how to starch them up and do it easy peasy, but it still takes some while because you got to boil starch in a bowl. And so plastic is generally what you're wearing now. Yeah, we all need plastic to cut into our necks. Anyway, that's what it is. It's easy peasy that way. What's next?
So you dress in a suit, you drive to the church,
right?
And you go to a room called the sacristy. Is that correct?
So in the Episcopal Church, and I would expect in many Roman Catholic churches, they have sacristies. Sacristies are where you hold sacred things, or things used for sacred offices. And so clergy go in there often to put on what are called vestments. That's where we keep the books and records of the church services that we provide. It's also in the Episcopal Church, where I'm a priest, where people gather to prepare the things that go on the altar for a church service. So the linens that go on the table and the wafers that are there for the bread and the wine that goes into the chalice or the pitcher in order to make sure it's served at the table. And in there, we keep a series of vestments that we put on. So there are two ways to go about this. There are two types of vestments that we wear: the Eucharistic vestments and or the morning prayer vestments. So for a long time, the Episcopal Church, one of its primary services was morning prayer. And that came about for all sorts of complicated reasons, which you can ask me about in another podcast. But since the mid 60s, and especially since the Book of Common Prayer 1979, the Episcopal Church has become more Eucharistically centered. So that means we have most Episcopal churches, not all, you can still find those that don't, but most Episcopal churches have communion at every service on a Sunday. And that means we bless bread and wine and distribute it to the people. And in the Episcopal Church, as is in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, the Eucharist is considered a sacrament. And it's a dominical sacrament because it was instituted by Jesus himself. So we prepare for that, and we wear special garments for that. So I take off my suit jacket. I might, depending on which garment I'm going to put on, take off my clergy vest. I wear a clergy vest generally, though today it's just a shirt with what this is called a dog collar. And that's the one that's white all the way around, and there's no black that comes up around it. And so we take off that vest, or we keep it on, and we put on a thing called the cassock alb. Now, the cassock alb is a new garment, and it's kind of a compromise. And it's got some heft to it, and it drapes nicely, and it's white. And we often wear some type of rope or girdle around it to keep it from blousing out too much. And it's a white garment. It's to remind us of our baptism. And it's called a cassock alb because it's actually a combination of two garments that used to be worn. And I'll explain those in a minute as well. Then when we've put on the cassock alb, we will tie the girdle around our waist, and then we will put on another garment, which is called a stole. Now, the stole is supposed to come historically from a scarf that was worn by the officials of the empire during the classical period of the Roman Empire. So it's after Constantine establishes the church as the official body of the state, and people can come out of hiding and they can put on their garments. And at some point, it was assumed that the clergy, because it was now the state church, were officials within the body of the Roman Empire. And so, like other Roman officials, they would wear the stole around their neck, and it's actually their mark of office. So I know many people think when I have my collar on, I've got the mark of my office. Well, no, that's just conservative fashion statement. When I'm wearing my stole, it means I'm preparing to do something on behalf of the church. So it could be Eucharist, baptism, confirmation, reconciliation, any number of things that I'm doing as part of the office of being a priest. So that would be the first garment I put on. And for many priests, they say prayers as they dress themselves because they want to center themselves in the work they're about to do for God. And so if you were to go into our sacristy and you open the door, you would see a set of prayers as you put on each garment.
Oh.
and you pray the prayer so that you are, dressing yourself for the work of God.
And are those prayers part of a prescribed rite, or are they your selection?
They are unofficial. It's not required. They are traditional, though. And so one of the things you find out in the church is we often do things not because they're prescribed per se, but because they're traditional and they've been handed down from generation to generation. So those particular prayers are most often used and prayed by priests who come out of what we would call the high church tradition in the Episcopal Church. So that's a descendant of the Tractarian and Oxford movement of the early 19th century. And it tied us back into the ancient Catholic traditions of the church after a long period of time where prominently in the Anglican churches, the reform movement of the Protestant Reformation was very prominent. And that's another thing we can talk about in another podcast, but that's where those come from. So they're not required. Many priests are sort of more casual about that, not all. Some priests prepare themselves in different ways. So I found those prayers. First of all, I found them in every church I've been in. So I've always followed somebody who's been more high church than myself. And I always find a set of prayers that are generally on the door that holds all the vestments. So I was lucky, and my predecessor put them up for me and for herself.
So far, you're wearing the white cassock alb, and you're wearing the stole.
Right.
What comes next? So
another garment, which is not required. So the only garment required for by tradition and by our prayer book for me to be wearing when I do communion is my stole. But in many churches, we have another garment that goes on top of the stole, and that would be a chasuble. And a chasuble comes again from the Roman Empire, and it was in late Rome, and it was a poncho. And there's a Latin term for it, and it sounds a lot like chasuble. The Latin term for it is a cassula. And so you can see where as it moves over into English, it got gummed up and became a chasuble, but it's a poncho. And you would have worn these, in outdoors or things that was over the fur. So especially in Northern Europe, when it's cold, you want to wear as many layers, especially when there's not central heating. You want to wear as many layers as possible. And the chasuble was both a decorative and practical garment. And so it comes in different colors. By the way, the stole does too. One of the things we joke about is many of the Catholic traditions, small c, but the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, we are color coded. And so seasonally, we changed the color of our vestments and our hangings in the church to signal certain things. So, in Lent and Advent, we have purple. There's now an Anglican. There's now an Anglican blue that has hit the market. Yeah, I think that was a conspiracy of Olney, but they also sell it out of Whipple and some of the other providers for clerical and church-related hangings. And it all is to signal a sense that this is a set season. So the reason it's more common in churches like the Catholic Church and the Episcopal churches, we have seasons of the year where we celebrate. Sundays are always a feast day, but we also have seasons laid over Sunday that are important and they're thematic. And so, Advent is a preparation season, and its color is either that sort of purple, violet, or it might be the Advent blue. The season of Christmas is white. The high seasons, our feast seasons are white. So we would wear vestments that match up with that. Now, that matching of the vestments and the hangings may not have occurred until you really get into the 17th, 18th, and 19th century when we could control the dye lots well. And quite often in churches before that, you just wore the best vestments you had for Christmas or Easter, the highest feast days of the year. But now, because we have better dye controls and things like that, we've color coded them. So you would have seen mixing and matching if you had gone into a medieval church. But if you go into a modern church, you will see that the priest, the celebrant, the presider of the communion will be wearing a stole that matches all the other hangings, and will be wearing a chasuble over the stole. I must also tell you, there are some places where the chasuble goes on before the stole, and then you lay the chasuble over, you lay the stole over the chasuble. I know it sounds confusing, and some of it is a fashion statement, but there is theology behind why you would do that. And so if you were to come to my church, and I walked out there now, after all of these things, I would have on a white garment that you could see, I would have a colored garment over top of everything, and you would see out of the bottom 2 little tabs that would be hanging down. So the chasuble, and then the stole would be the tabs that are hanging down. So that's what I would be wearing throughout the service as we went through.
So you mentioned purple as a Lenten and Advent color. Is that because they're penitential seasons or preparatory seasons?
So, we now over long history have associated certain colors with certain seasons. Actually, if you were to go back to some of the medieval calendars, you would find that they didn't all match up and they weren't universal. But since the 20th century began, we've moved in that direction. So if you were to go to a Lutheran church or an Episcopal church or a Catholic church during the traditional seasons of the calendar year, you would find that, yes, we have certain associations. So purple, and most churches can't afford multiple sets of these things. The purple would be, used both in Lent and Advent. Now, Advent was once also a penitential season, but we've over time considered it more of an anticipatory season without sort of the same disciplines that you had in Lent. But it's true that if you were to go back and look at history, say in the 4th or 5th century in England, they would have considered it a penitential season, would have given up a lot of foods before the feasting that was done after Christmas. The same thing is true in Lent. You do all sorts of things to remind yourself who you belong to. Some people talk about giving up things, and that's all true and good. But the real purpose of Lent and Advent is either by taking on disciplines and giving things up, or a combination of both. You're trying to remind yourself that you belong to God, and all the resources that come to us are from God, and that we want to prepare for those feast seasons by really, really, really focusing on a lot of what God has taught and presented to us. So in Lent, there are a lot of things about the movement from Jesus's regular ministry into Holy Week. In Advent, you're also rehearsing sort of salvation history in the readings and in the music about God entering the world. And so they're both preparatory seasons. One just happens to be more penitential, and you just want to, that's what we call it. It's a time in the ancient church. It was a time where if you'd been misbehaving in your community, it's actually in a prelude read in the Book of Common Prayer. People were often separated out to do penitential things so they could be reconciled to the community, especially before Easter happened, because you wanted to take communion on Easter. And so that's what it is. The white is, I don't know why they chose white. It could be gold, but white is the seasons of the high feast. So it's Christmas. Yeah, we think in regular culture, Christmas is about red, gold, and green. No, it's about white for the church. And the same thing happens in Easter. And so beginning on the great vigil of Easter, which happens after sundown on the night before Easter, you start wearing white and you go all the way through the season of Easter, which encompasses 7 Sundays. And then you have a feast called Pentecost, which honors the creation of the church and the flames of fire. So red are the vestments, and we get to wear red twice a year. We get to wear it during Palm Sunday, and we get to wear it on Feast of Pentecost. And then in the Roman Catholic Church, where they celebrate Eucharist almost daily, if not daily, they may wear red at other times for certain martyr feasts that they're celebrating. There are some high Episcopal churches that do the same thing. And there's one more color, it's green, and that's associated with sort of more, and I hate to say ordinary because all time for God is special, but seasons that aren't big about either penitence or feasting. So that occurs after Christmas and before Advent, after Christmas and before Lent. So the season we're talking about there is called Epiphany, after the Epiphany. And then after the Feast of Pentecost, it's green from then until you hit Advent again, with a couple of exceptions.
Now, you mentioned earlier that all of this is different if it's not a Eucharistic service, that
Sure.
if you're observing morning prayer, for example.
Right.
Now I've seen you wear, I think, a black cassock.
Yep.
How is it different?
So here's what would have happened, and this is the addendum to the Eucharistic vestments that I did not get to. So streetwear for clergy for a very long time, before we started wearing, clericals called, black suits or suits that are very dark with a, black shirt or a black vest, and then, the collar. We wore a thing called the cassock, which was streetwear in ancient Rome. And it was just the primary garment that people wore walking around. And so you might have worn it under a toga if you were in the Roman Empire. In Greece, there was another garment that you would have worn it under. So it was kind of an undergarment. It covered you from your neck down to your top of your feet. And I guess you could keep it airy in the summer and layer it in the winter, but that's the primary garment that people wore, and it continued onward. And that's how the clergy, as you went into the Middle Ages, were known, is they would have continued to wear the cassock, which primarily among the clergy, like our, dark suits in the 20th century, they tended to be dark or black. And that's how you knew. Now, I will tell you, bishops and deans of cathedrals get to, kind of stretch their legs. In the Anglican Communion, a bishop got to wear a red garment, a red cassock, and the dean of the cathedral or a canon to the ordinary got to wear a purple one. Now, here in the United States of America, a lot of our bishops wear purple as well, but it's a plain garment, and the people who are higher up in the hierarchy get to wear a more flamboyant one. But the rest of us wear black, and so that cassock and there are two types. There's the Roman variety, which has like 1,000 buttons right down the front, and it's single-breasted. And then because the British, we know they're sartorially resplendent, they have a double-breasted variety. It's just an easy garment to get into, and it has nothing to do with Savile Row. And so you would put that on, and then for morning prayer, I would put on a thing called a cassock. Now I wear an Anglican cassock, which is long and flowy and almost goes down to below mid-calf. And the sleeves are long, and if you hold them out, you can look like you have angel wings. And so that's what was worn. And in fact, in the 1552 prayer book, which was the first English prayer book in English, it was prescribed that that's what the priest would wear for church services, including the Eucharist. So that's what they would wear. And so we still wear those at morning prayer. And quite often, if your church is very traditionally morning prayer, they would wear a black tippet, which was prescribed in that 1552 prayer book. And it's an academic garment. It shows that you have studied at least through a master's degree. And then they would wear an academic hood, and they would preach and do their services in those things. And so for a long time, and my first parish that I served in, those were our primary garments. We actually never wore the cassock and the stole and chasuble. We wore cassock, long surplice, and stole. So that's how people would know we were doing the Eucharistic services, and we'd wear our tippets when we were just doing morning prayer. And the primary thing was preaching. So that's where those come from. There's another garment, by the way, that you can adapt. It's not the cassock alb, it's the alb. It's a white garment, and it's longer. It goes all the way to almost covering your cassock, and it's got long sleeves. And when a priest was doing a Eucharistic service, that's the garment they would put over their cassock. Remember, the cassock's streetwear. And they would just simply cover the cassock so that they could then put on their stole and chasubles to do the Eucharistic service. If you go to Rome, you will still probably see some priests, young deacons, who are being instructed in the schools in Rome, walking around the streets wearing the long black cassocks. Some of them have wide brimmed caps and things like that. Those are all academic wear. It still will make you very noticeable within the context of Christianity and the Western European countries.
So we're coming up on our 30-minute format. We're going to go to a lightning round, which will enable us to get to know the upstanding rector a little bit better. But there's one thing I'm worried about before we move to that. You mentioned a company called Almies. So is Almies like Amazon for clergy? Can anyone go on there and order garments and potentially pose as clergy?
Yeah, you don't need a license to buy anything from Almy, and I'm sure they would be happy to sell it to you. They are known as a clerical company, and very few people go to buy clerical wear in this day and age outside of that. But there are a number of British companies as well that do that. So who outfits the priests in the Roman Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church with these garments, because they're not made by normal manufacturers anymore. So there is a small grouping of clerical supply companies and sometimes purveyors of clerical supplies who buy from these manufacturers, and they sell them, and they do not ask for identification when you walk.
Okay, all right. Sounds like a loose end to me, but it sounds like it's not been widely exploited. I hope that this podcast won't touch off of it.
Well, that's when we'll get the canonical and liturgical police searching for them if they ever violate that.
They'll never find us. So, lightning round, David.
Okay.
Favorite evangelist?
Mark.
Favorite Old Testament book?
It's two books, but in the Jewish tradition, it's one. Ezra Nehemiah.
Okay. And what's your favorite day to preach?
Favorite day to preach. Um, I like the Sundays that aren't Easter and Christmas the best. It's great to preach an Easter sermon and a Christmas sermon. It's just that happens every year. It's the same story every year, and it's wonderful. But the stories are so powerful in and of themselves. I think it's hard to enhance them. And so I just find it. I find the other smaller stories somewhat more fascinating and illuminating in ways that the big stories, number one, are self-explanatory about, and number two, are heard so often about. So I hate to say it, but and it's not novelty. It's just there are surprising things to be found in the Gospels, and and sometimes it's not in the big stories.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so almost any Sunday that's not the the two big feast days, and simply because they haven't been heard before, or they aren't remembered as well, and that's why.
Well, that is our first episode of The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian, and we look forward to engaging again very soon. Bye, David.
Is that our time to sign off?
Yes, it is.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. All right. Okay.